Let's take a look at Illuminated Manuscripts in Chapter 4. Illuminated manuscripts is the term we use to describe all decorated and illustrated handwritten books that were produced from the late Roman Empire until printed books replaced manuscripts after type was developed in Europe around AD 1450. During the 1,000-year medieval era, from the 5th century fall of Rome until the 15th century Renaissance, the knowledge and learning of the classical world was almost entirely lost. The general population languished in illiteracy, poverty, and superstition. Regional isolation and difficult travel caused regional design styles to emerge. Our book discusses 8 distinctive schools of manuscripts and gives insights into the historical and social context that surround their development. Although classical literature was preserved in manuscripts, most illuminated manuscripts were sacred writings. So let's first look at the classical style that comes from Greek and Roman classical antiquity. If we compare these books to other illuminated manuscripts, we'll notice that the text and layout was lettered in rustic capitals in one wide column on each page. Illustrations and ornaments used a very simple technique with an almost cinematic graphic sequence, kind of like contemporary comic books. There was illusionistic space, and like the walls of frescoes that you might see preserved at Pompeii, a bunch of small illustrations were inserted throughout the text. They were often the same width as the text, as you see the example in the upper right. Illustrations were framed in bright bands of color, frequently red, Virgil. Here we see the typography that would be in this type of manuscript. There were uncials and half uncials. These are from the 6th century CE. This particular specimen was written in a monastery in southern Italy, and it demonstrates the emergence of ascenders, so the part of the text that goes up, and descenders, the part of the text that descends below the baseline of the text. Celtic manuscripts can be identified by stylized figures of animal with pagan influences and human figures. They're two-dimensional with no deep space, and they have what we call cloisonnism or heavy outlines. There are flat colors, interlaces and lacertines, and uncial letters. The Book of Kells, which is a Celtic book design from Ireland, is considered the most stunning of all the illuminated manuscripts, and it is Ireland's most treasured religious artifact. It was believed to be created on the island of Iona off the Scottish coast, illuminated by monks. Now, Iona was frequently attacked by Vikings, which led to most of the monks fleeing for the relative safety of Ireland and Scotland. There's a wonderful animated movie that I encourage you to check out called The Secret of Kells. It's award-winning and goes into this story. If we look at the text and layout, we notice incredibly ornate initials. They use something called diminuendo, which is a descending scale of letter size and graphic information to integrate these initials with the rest of the text. They introduced word space and they used half-uncial script. If we look at the illustrations and ornaments, we can tell they use drafting instruments to create abstract and extremely complex geometric linear patterns. Notice they're bright, they have pure colors, they have ornamental frames and borders and what we call carpet pages. Take a look at this lavishly decorated text and illumination. The Book of Kells was created by Columban monasteries in Ireland and Scotland. Here we see the Book of Durrow. the opening page, which is the Gospel of St. Mark from 680 CE. Linked into a ligature, an I and an N become an aesthetic form of interlaced threads and coiling spiral motifs. So a ligature is when you fuse two letter forms, and it's used often in logo design today. On the right, we see the man symbol of Matthew from 680 CE, and it's as flat as a cubist painting and constructed from simple geometric forms. This figure, facing the opening of the Gospel of St. Matthew, wears a checkered pattern of yellow, red, and green squares, and tile-like pattern texture is evident. Let's take a look at Carolinian manuscripts. They have naturalism. There's an attempt to copy classical illustrations. We see shading for volume, landscape elements, classical borders and increased white space, and type that's called Caroline minuscules. Under Charlemagne, the whole of Central Europe was united as the Holy Roman Empire in AD 800. As far as text and layout goes, these illuminated manuscripts show that Charlemagne standardized page layout, writing style, and decoration. He reformed the alphabet, which he modeled after the ordinary writing script of the late antique period, but he combined it with Celtic innovations, like the use of guidelines, ascenders, and descenders. This led to the development of an ordered, uniform script we call Caroline minuscules, and they're the forerunner of our lowercase alphabet. Roman capitals were studied and adopted, and sentence structure and punctuation was revised. If we look at the illustrations and ornament, we see a separation of figurative imagery and ornament. Illustration moved from the 2D flat style toward the accurate drawing and more illusionistic techniques of the classical period. Here's a detail of Caroline minuscules. This was a practical and easy way to write, and as I said earlier, it's the forerunner of our lowercase alphabet. Characters were set apart instead of joined, so the number of ligatures was reduced. It was an effort under King Charlemagne to increase the uniformity, clarity, and legibility of handwriting in the late 8th century. I wanted to show you examples of Spanish pictorial expression. When we look at the text and layout of these manuscripts, we see a 2-column layout shown with Roman capitals that appear to be Caroline minuscules with exaggerated ascenders and descenders. Letter forms really show Islamic influences in the decorative elements. Islamic design motifs are mingled with Christian tradition, such as prophecy. We have flat shapes of intense, optically contrasting color that's sprinkled with stars, rosettes, polygons, and garlands, and this sort of flat schematic drawing with prominent outlines. These animals are totem-like. Often we see almost ghastly creatures and decorative frames with very intricate geometric patterns that enclose the illustrations. Examples of these Spanish manuscripts include the Commentary on Job and the Apocalypse of St. John the Divine. Let's take a look now at Gothic manuscripts. We have attenuated figures with vertical emphasis, idealized figures and settings, and textura letters. When we look at Romanesque and Gothic manuscripts, in the text and layout, we see universal design characteristics that seem possible because visual ideas were traveling back and forth on the pilgrimage routes. In the Gothic period, scribes used textura lettering, often in 2 columns, because the condensed vertical strokes saved space. This created a dense black texture. Illustration and ornament in the Romanesque period saw an illusionistic revival of linear drawing, distorted figures that kind of melded the overall page design and flat backgrounds. In the Gothic period, illustrations were divided into segments by elaborate framing. Elongated figures wore elegant, fashionable clothing, symbolic imagery, and there was a mellow color palette. We see this in the Douche Apocalypse or the Ormsby Psalter. Now let's talk a bit about Judaic manuscripts. Of course, in terms of text and layout, we had Hebrew calligraphy because the word was supreme. We saw artistic embellishment for educational reasons or to adorn religious objects. This included figurative art, and it was encouraged as an expression of reverence for the sacred objects in writing. Illustrations really played a supporting role to the word. So let's take a look now at some Islamic manuscripts. We have Islamic calligraphy. Negative spaces really become concrete forms, and text and illustrations are framed with multiple lines and complex ornamental borders. There's very intricate geometric and arabesque designs in the illustration and ornament. Miniature paintings had elaborate detail and intricate patterns and vibrant color. Space was flat and shallow. We had warm, cool, and light-dark color combinations, as we see on the left. Examples of this are the Quran frontispiece. On the right, we see an Islamic manuscript created in the early 1700s. The Indian Emperor Shah Jahan, who reigned from 1627 to 1658, is holding court, and he's making ceremonial presentations. Here we see a manuscript Quran from 1739, a good example of those intricate patterns with interlocking forms and vibrant color. Now I want to talk about Incubabula Northern European type books. They have text-based fonts, woodcuts used for illustrations, hand-lettered capitals, and heavy ornate borders and illustrations. These are late medieval illuminated manuscripts. The Book of Hours became very popular for private use, and more emphasis is placed on illustration, less on text. Illustrations dominate the page layout with convincing realism. We have an atmospheric perspective, linear perspective. Here we see a good example of textura, or the black letter font. Let's take a moment to leaf through one of these beautiful illuminated manuscripts. I want to end by showing you some contemporary examples of graphic design inspired by the historical illuminated manuscripts. This is the work of Jess Keir. It's a type designer box called the Typostles box. It's really a sarcastic visual twist that's highlighting 5 type designers in a delightfully sacrilegious way. The cards are contained in a box fashioned after a medieval Bible, but the cards themselves draw inspiration from illuminated manuscripts. Each one comes with a prayer for the type designer. So here we see Adrian Frutiger and Eric Gill, who we're going to see later in our course, great type designers, and the card tributes to them.